The morning fog hung low over Fort Braxton like a shroud of anticipation, its tendrils weaving between the stark barracks and across the parade ground where destiny would soon unfold. In the pre-dawn darkness, the sounds of military precision echoed through the corridors, boots hitting concrete in rhythmic unison, drill sergeants barking orders, and the metallic clanging of equipment being prepared for another day of transformation. Yet amid this symphony of military efficiency, there was an undercurrent of something else, the quiet buzz of anticipation and cruel amusement that precedes a spectacle. The source of this anticipation stood awkwardly in the equipment room, fumbling with gear that seemed designed for someone twice his size and half his nervousness. Marcus Webb, though few bothered to learn his name in those early days, represented everything that elite military units typically filtered out before reaching this level. At 22, he possessed the physical presence of someone who had spent more time with books than barbells, more hours in computer labs than combat training. His 5 feet 7 inches frame carried barely 140 pounds, distributed in a way that made standard-issue combat gear look like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The irony was not lost on those who observed him that first week. Fort Braxton housed the most elite special operations candidates in the military, drawn from the finest units across all branches of service. These were men who had already proven themselves in conventional forces, who had distinguished themselves through years of service, combat experience, and unwavering dedication to excellence. They arrived at Fort Braxton with chests full of medals, records of achievement, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you belong among the best. And then, there was Marcus Webb. His arrival had been met with the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for witnessing something so unexpected that the mind requires a moment to process what it's seeing. The administrative error, for surely that's what it was, would be corrected soon enough. Someone in personnel had mixed up files, confused candidates, or simply made the kind of clerical mistake that would become legend in military bureaucracy. There was simply no other explanation for how someone like Marcus Webb could have ended up among the candidates for the most demanding special operations program in the military. The first clue to the scope of the misunderstanding came during the initial physical assessment. While other candidates moved through the obstacle course with the fluid grace of natural athletes, Marcus approached each obstacle like a complex engineering problem requiring careful analysis. His technique was methodical rather than instinctive, intellectual rather than physical. He completed the course, barely, in a time that would have been respectable for a weekend warrior but was laughably slow by the standards of elite military training. The laughter began the first day and continued throughout the first week. It wasn't malicious in nature, at least not initially. Military culture has always included a certain amount of ribbing and testing, a way of measuring character under pressure and building cohesion through shared adversity. But what Marcus experienced went beyond typical military hazing. It was the kind of comprehensive dismissal reserved for those who so clearly don't belong that their very presence becomes a source of entertainment. During weapons training, Marcus's unfamiliarity with advanced tactical firearms became painfully obvious. While other candidates field-stripped and reassembled their weapons with the unconscious competence of surgeons, Marcus struggled with basic operations. His shots scattered across the target like abstract art, prompting the range instructor to wonder aloud whether the military had begun recruiting from art schools. The comment drew appreciative chuckles from the other candidates, who had grown accustomed to using Marcus's struggles as comic relief from the intensity of their own training. The mess hall provided daily entertainment as Marcus attempted to navigate the complex social dynamics of elite military culture. Conversations would pause when he approached, not out of respect but out of curiosity about what kind of awkward moment he might provide that day. His attempts to contribute to discussions about combat tactics or military history were met with the kind of polite attention typically reserved for children trying to participate in adult conversations. Even the drill instructors seemed unsure how to handle Marcus. Their usual methods of motivation, intimidation, public humiliation, and aggressive encouragement seemed almost cruel when applied to someone so clearly out of his depth. The cognitive dissonance of having someone so unsuited for special operations training in their program created a kind of parallel universe where normal rules didn't seem to apply. But perhaps the most telling aspect of those first weeks was not what people said about Marcus, but what they didn't say. Nobody questioned his presence directly. Military culture includes a deep respect for the chain of command and the assumption that orders come from authority with access to information that subordinates don't possess. If Marcus Webb was there, there must be a reason. That the reason was incomprehensible to everyone involved only added to the surreal nature of the situation. The pattern established in those early days became self-reinforcing. Each failure confirmed what everyone already knew: Marcus didn't belong. Each struggle validated the assumption that this was all some elaborate mistake that would soon be corrected. The laughter became routine, expected, almost comforting in its predictability. In a world where everything else was designed to challenge assumptions and push boundaries, Marcus's consistent inadequacy became the one constant everyone could rely on. What nobody recognized in those early weeks, not his fellow candidates, not the instructors, not even Marcus himself, was that they were witnessing the most crucial phase of what would become one of the most remarkable transformations in military training history. The foundations of that transformation were being laid not in the moments of success, but in the moments of failure. Not in the demonstrations of strength, but in the accumulation of weakness. Not in the respect of peers, but in their dismissal and ridicule. The human psyche responds to pressure in ways that often defy logical prediction. For some, sustained mockery and failure create a downward spiral of self-doubt and eventual capitulation. For others, it creates something far more dangerous to those doing the mocking, a burning core of determination that grows stronger with each attempt to diminish it. Marcus Webb, whether through some quirk of personality, childhood experience, or simple stubborn refusal to accept the obvious, fell into the latter category. But this transformation wasn't visible in those early weeks. To outside observers, Marcus appeared to be exactly what he seemed: a physically unimpressive, tactically inexperienced, socially awkward mistake who would soon be quietly transferred to a more appropriate assignment. The laughter continued because there was nothing to suggest it should stop. Every day brought new evidence that Marcus Webb was exactly what he appeared to be. The cruel irony was that this very perception, this complete dismissal of his potential, was creating the exact conditions necessary for his eventual metamorphosis. In environments where everyone is expected to excel, the pressure to maintain appearances can actually inhibit genuine growth. When expectations are low to non-existent, there's a peculiar freedom to experiment, to fail completely, to rebuild from the ground up without the burden of maintaining a reputation. Marcus was unknowingly benefiting from what psychologists might recognize as the power of rock bottom. When you've already been written off, when failure is expected and success is unimaginable, the normal fears that inhibit performance begin to lose their power. There's nothing left to lose because you've already lost everything that could be taken from you: respect, credibility, the assumption of competence. This psychological state, while painful in the short term, creates conditions for a type of learning and growth that's impossible when operating from a position of assumed strength. Every small improvement becomes significant when starting from zero. Every minor success carries the weight of revelation because it contradicts everything everyone believed possible. But the most important factor in Marcus's eventual transformation was something that wouldn't become apparent until much later: his response to the laughter itself. While others might have internalized the mockery as confirmation of their inadequacy, Marcus began to develop a different relationship with it. Rather than seeing the laughter as judgment of his worth, he began to understand it as information about the gap between his current state and his desired destination. This reframing was gradual and largely unconscious, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he processed feedback. Instead of asking, "Why are they laughing at me?" he began asking, "What specifically are they laughing at, and how do I address those specific deficiencies?" The laughter became data rather than destruction, intelligence rather than insult. The weeks continued with their predictable rhythm of struggle and mockery. Marcus's performance improved incrementally, so slowly that the improvements were invisible to casual observation but measurable to those keeping detailed records. His times on the obstacle course dropped by seconds here and there. His accuracy with weapons increased marginally. His understanding of tactical concepts deepened imperceptibly. But these micro-improvements occurred beneath the threshold of notice for his peers and instructors, who had already formed their conclusions about his capabilities. The human brain's tendency to see what it expects to see meant that small improvements were either ignored or dismissed as statistical noise. The narrative of Marcus's incompetence had become so established that contradictory evidence was automatically filtered out. This created a feedback loop that would prove crucial to what followed. Because his improvements went unnoticed, Marcus was freed from the pressure to perform for others' approval and could focus entirely on the internal satisfaction of incremental progress. Without the distraction of external validation, his development could follow its own organic timeline, building genuine competence rather than impressive displays. The other candidates, meanwhile, were operating under entirely different pressures. Their demonstrated competence created expectations that had to be met or exceeded. Their success was visible and, therefore, subject to scrutiny, comparison, and the constant pressure to maintain their reputation. This visibility, while rewarding in terms of respect and recognition, could also be limiting in terms of genuine experimentation and growth. Marcus was developing what would later be recognized as one of the most important characteristics of truly elite performers: the ability to remain completely focused on process rather than outcome, on improvement rather than image, on substance rather than appearance. This focus was born not from superior wisdom or training, but from the necessity of his situation. When you have no image to maintain, you can focus entirely on building capability. The physical demands of special operations training are designed to reveal character under extreme stress. The assumption is that people will eventually reach their breaking point and that observing how they respond to that pressure will reveal their true nature. What the program didn't account for was someone whose breaking point was so far beyond everyone's expectations that they would reach it long after everyone had stopped paying attention. Marcus's breaking point, when it came, would be different from what the program was designed to identify. It wouldn't be a moment of physical failure or emotional collapse. Instead, it would be the moment when the accumulated weight of dismissal and ridicule finally exceeded his capacity to absorb it without response. But that response, when it came, would take a form that no one, least of all Marcus himself, could have predicted. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the history of the program. All the elements were in place: a person written off completely by everyone around him, a systematic underestimation of his potential, a pressure cooker environment designed to reveal hidden capabilities, and, most importantly, a psychological framework that had reframed failure as information and mockery as motivation. What happened next would challenge every assumption about human potential, military training, and the relationship between perception and reality. It would demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is not the one everyone fears, but the one everyone ignores. And it would prove that the man who has learned to destroy his weak self in the crucible of others' contempt has indeed become immune to destruction by those same others. The laughter was about to stop. Part 2, the metamorphosis in motion. The transformation didn't happen overnight, despite how the legend would later portray it. Like all genuine metamorphoses, it was a gradual process that occurred largely out of sight, in the spaces between official training exercises, in the quiet hours when others slept, and in the psychological realm where true change begins long before it manifests in physical reality. By the third week of training, a routine had been established. Marcus would struggle through each day's exercises, providing his now expected entertainment value to his fellow candidates, while the instructors maintained their professional demeanor despite clearly harboring private doubts about his placement in the program. The administrative machinery of the military moved slowly, and whatever error had placed Marcus among elite special operations candidates was apparently taking time to correct through proper channels. But something was happening beneath the surface of these predictable interactions, something that would have been invisible to casual observers but was beginning to register in the detailed records kept by the training cadre. Marcus's performance metrics were improving, not dramatically, but consistently. His obstacle course times had dropped from embarrassingly slow to merely poor. His weapons accuracy had progressed from dangerous to mediocre. His tactical knowledge, tested through written examinations and practical exercises, was showing steady if unspectacular improvement. These improvements might have been noticed and celebrated in a conventional training environment, but Fort Braxton operated by different standards. What constituted progress for Marcus was still far below the baseline expectations for other candidates. The gap between his best performance and their average was so large that his improvements seemed insignificant by comparison. It was like celebrating a marathon time of 3 hours when running against athletes who finished in under 2.5. The invisibility of his progress served Marcus in ways that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Free from the pressure of external expectations and the burden of others' investment in his success, he could focus entirely on the intrinsic satisfaction of improvement. Each marginal gain in performance was meaningful to him because he understood exactly how much effort it had required and could feel the accumulation of small victories building something larger within him. More importantly, the consistent dismissal from others was forcing Marcus to develop an internal reference system for measuring his worth and progress. Instead of seeking validation from instructors or peers, he began to rely on his own assessment of whether he was moving closer to his goals. This internalization of motivation and standards would prove to be one of his greatest advantages when the moment of truth finally arrived. The fourth week brought the first indication that something significant was building beneath the surface of Marcus's public struggles. During a combat simulation exercise designed to test tactical decision-making under pressure, Marcus displayed an analytical capability that caught the attention of several instructors. While other candidates relied on their physical abilities and conventional training to navigate the scenario, Marcus approached it like a complex problem requiring innovative solutions. His physical execution was still subpar, but his strategic thinking was beginning to show flashes of brilliance. He identified weaknesses in the exercise design that other candidates missed, proposed alternative approaches that demonstrated deeper understanding of the underlying principles, and showed an ability to adapt his tactics based on changing circumstances. For the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, Marcus had demonstrated a capability that exceeded the performance of his peers. The response to this demonstration was telling. Rather than recognizing it as evidence of hidden potential, the instructors and other candidates dismissed it as an anomaly, a lucky guess or momentary insight that didn't reflect his true capabilities. The established narrative of Marcus's incompetence was so strong that contradictory evidence was automatically reframed to fit existing assumptions. He was still the mistake who didn't belong, he had simply gotten lucky in one small aspect of one exercise. This dismissal of his emerging capabilities was actually accelerating Marcus's transformation rather than hindering it. Each time his improvements were ignored or explained away, it reinforced his growing independence from external validation. He was learning to trust his own assessment of his progress and to derive satisfaction from internal rather than external sources. This psychological shift was creating the conditions for sustained excellence that didn't depend on others' recognition or approval. The fifth week marked a turning point that was invisible to outside observers but seismic in its impact on Marcus's internal development. During a particularly brutal physical training session, something clicked into place. The countless hours of struggling with exercises that came naturally to others had been building not just physical strength but something more important, an understanding of his body's capabilities and limitations that was far more precise than what most naturally gifted athletes ever develop. Because Marcus had to think about every movement, analyze every technique, and consciously develop skills that others performed instinctively, he had developed a level of body awareness and technical understanding that exceeded his peers. His movements were becoming more efficient, his energy expenditure more calculated, his approach to physical challenges more sophisticated. He was still not the strongest or fastest candidate, but he was becoming the most technically proficient. This technical mastery was beginning to compound. Each skill he developed made the next one easier to acquire. Each improvement in his understanding of biomechanics and tactical principles accelerated his progress in related areas. The methodical, analytical approach that had initially slowed his learning was now creating a foundation for exponential rather than linear improvement. The transformation was also occurring at a psychological level that was even more significant than the physical improvements. The weeks of sustained mockery and dismissal had burned away everything in Marcus's personality that was dependent on others' approval or recognition. What remained was a core of determination and self-belief that had been forged in the fire of adversity and tempered by the necessity of complete self-reliance. This psychological transformation manifested in subtle ways that were beginning to concern some of the more observant instructors. Marcus's responses to failure were changing. Instead of the dejection and embarrassment that had characterized his early weeks, he was displaying an almost unsettling equanimity when things went wrong. Failed exercises were met with analytical assessment rather than emotional reaction. Criticism was received as information rather than judgment. The laughter of others was beginning to have no visible effect on him whatsoever. This emotional independence was perhaps the most threatening aspect of Marcus's development from the perspective of traditional military training philosophy. The program was designed to break down individuals and rebuild them according to institutional standards. But Marcus appeared to be rebuilding himself according to his own standards, using the pressure of the program as raw material for his own transformation rather than submitting to the institution's vision of what he should become. By the 6th week, the gap between Marcus's internal development and external perception had grown so large that a collision was becoming inevitable. His actual capabilities were approaching and, in some areas, exceeding those of other candidates, but his reputation remained that of the incompetent recruit who provided comic relief. This disconnect between reality and perception was creating a tension that could not be sustained indefinitely. The other candidates had settled into a comfortable routine of superiority over Marcus. His presence provided them with a constant reminder of their own elite status and gave them someone against whom they could measure their excellence. The laughter had become reflexive rather than considered, a conditioned response to Marcus's presence rather than a reaction to his actual performance. But Marcus was no longer the same person who had arrived at Fort Braxton 6 weeks earlier. The physical changes were significant. He had gained muscle mass, improved his cardiovascular fitness, and developed technical skills that rivaled those of candidates with years more experience. But the psychological changes were revolutionary. He had become someone who derived his sense of worth entirely from internal sources, who was motivated by personal standards rather than external approval, and who had learned to transmute others' contempt into fuel for his own development. The 7th week brought the exercise that would change everything. The training cadre had designed a comprehensive evaluation that would test all aspects of special operations capability, physical fitness, technical skills, tactical decision-making, leadership under pressure, and psychological resilience. It was meant to be the culmination of everything the candidates had learned, a demonstration of their readiness for the most demanding missions their military careers would offer. For most candidates, this represented an opportunity to showcase their abilities and confirm their status as elite operators. For Marcus, it represented something entirely different, the first chance to demonstrate publicly what he had been building in private for 7 weeks. The gap between perception and reality was about to be revealed, and the revelation would shock everyone involved. The exercise was designed as a complex scenario that would unfold over several days, testing candidates individually and as teams under conditions that approximated real-world special operations missions. Each candidate would have opportunities to lead and follow, to demonstrate technical expertise and tactical acumen, to show physical capability and mental resilience. What the designers of the exercise didn't anticipate was that they had created the perfect stage for someone who had spent 7 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of comprehensive evaluation. Marcus had been tested and found wanting in every individual component that would be part of the exercise. But he had also been using each failure as a learning opportunity, each criticism as a roadmap for improvement, each moment of mockery as motivation to exceed the standards that others took for granted. The other candidates approached the exercise with the confidence of proven performers. They had been succeeding in training exercises for weeks and had no reason to expect that this evaluation would be any different. Their preparation was thorough but routine, based on extending their existing capabilities rather than discovering new ones. Marcus approached the exercise with the intensity of someone for whom it represented vindication or final failure. He had been preparing not just for 7 weeks, but for his entire life, for a moment when he could prove that others' assessments of his worth were fundamentally wrong. The exercise wasn't just a training evaluation for him, it was a chance to demonstrate that the man who had learned to destroy his weak self could indeed not be destroyed by others. The stage was set for a confrontation between perception and reality, between assumption and capability, between the comfortable certainties of established hierarchies and the uncomfortable truth that human potential often exceeds our ability to recognize it. What happened in the next 40 seconds would challenge every assumption that had been made about Marcus Webb and force everyone involved to reconsider their understanding of what it means to be truly strong. The laughter was about to transform into stunned silence. Part 3, The Crucible of Truth. The morning of the comprehensive evaluation dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that seems to sharpen everything it touches: sounds, sights, and, most importantly, perceptions. The training cadre had assembled at 0500 hours to review the exercise parameters one final time, while the candidates prepared their equipment with the methodical precision that had become second nature over 7 weeks of intensive training. The exercise scenario was deceptively straightforward in its briefing but diabolically complex in its execution. Each candidate would navigate a series of interconnected challenges that would test every skill they had developed: a stealth infiltration requiring precise movement and tactical awareness, a marksmanship component under extreme time pressure, a physical obstacle course incorporating elements they had never encountered before, and, finally, a leadership challenge where they would coordinate the actions of other candidates in a simulated crisis scenario. What made this evaluation particularly demanding was its cumulative nature. Each component built on the previous one, so that fatigue and stress would compound throughout the exercise. A candidate who struggled early would find later challenges exponentially more difficult, while someone who excelled in the opening phases would build momentum and confidence that could carry them through to exceptional performance. The order of participation had been determined randomly, with Marcus scheduled to perform approximately midway through the group. This timing would prove crucial, as it meant the other candidates would have had opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities before Marcus faced his moment of truth. Their performances would establish the baseline against which his efforts would be measured, and, given the established pecking order of the previous 7 weeks, expectations for his performance remained rock bottom. The first candidates through the exercise performed exactly as predicted. They moved through each component with professional competence, demonstrating the skills and attributes that had earned them places in the program. Their times were respectable, their accuracy adequate, their tactical decisions sound if unimaginative. They were confirming their status as capable special operations candidates without transcending into anything approaching greatness. As Marcus's turn approached, the atmosphere among the observing candidates took on the familiar quality of anticipation that had characterized his previous performances. The unspoken assumption was that they were about to witness another demonstration of his fundamental unsuitability for the program, another moment of comic relief in an otherwise serious evaluation. The instructors checked their stopwatches and clipboards with professional detachment, prepared to document what they expected would be a subpar performance that would finally provide the justification for his removal from the program. Marcus himself appeared outwardly calm as he checked his equipment and received his final briefing. But, beneath the surface, something profound was happening. All the preparation, all the accumulated knowledge, all the techniques he had developed during weeks of private struggle were crystallizing into a state of readiness that he had never experienced before. The mockery and dismissal of the previous weeks had burned away every trace of self-doubt and external dependency, leaving only a core of absolute determination and complete technical preparation. The infiltration phase began at precisely 0800 hours. Marcus moved to the starting position with the same methodical approach that had characterized all his previous efforts, but there was something different in his bearing that the more observant instructors began to notice. The nervous energy that had marked his early performances was gone, replaced by a stillness that spoke of complete focus and internal confidence. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be analyzed and reanalyzed for years afterward by military training specialists, but the basic facts were undisputable. Marcus moved through the infiltration course not just faster than anyone had expected, but faster than anyone had moved before. His path through the obstacles was not just efficient but innovative, demonstrating an understanding of the terrain and tactical principles that exceeded anything shown by previous candidates. His movement was not just swift but invisible. The sensors designed to detect infiltrators registered his presence only intermittently, as if he were moving through the course like smoke, present one moment and gone the next. The route he chose avoided not just the obvious detection points but ones that even the course designers had forgotten they had included. He was not just beating the exercise, he was demonstrating a level of tactical awareness that suggested he understood it better than the people who had created it. The observers watching the live feed found themselves leaning forward in disbelief. The person they were watching could not possibly be the same Marcus Webb who had struggled with basic equipment checks 7 weeks earlier. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it seemed to violate fundamental assumptions about human capability and the pace at which skills could be developed. But the infiltration was only the beginning. Marcus transitioned to the marksmanship component without the usual pause to collect himself that other candidates had required. His first shot struck the target dead center, followed by a second, a third, a fourth. His accuracy was not just acceptable, it was perfect. His speed was not just adequate, it was unprecedented. He was firing with the precision of a master marksman and the rhythm of someone for whom perfect accuracy had become as natural as breathing. The range instructor, a man who had observed thousands of candidates over his career, found himself staring at the target in confusion. The grouping Marcus had just produced was tighter than any he had seen in 15 years of special operations training. The speed at which he had achieved it was breaking records that had stood since the program's inception. The person firing those shots could not be the same person who had scattered rounds across the target during his first week. The physical obstacle course that followed provided the most stunning demonstration yet. Marcus attacked each obstacle with a combination of technique, strength, and tactical intelligence that left observers speechless. His approach to each challenge was not just effective but elegant, demonstrating an understanding of biomechanics and engineering principles that transformed brute force obstacles into exercises in applied physics. His time through the course obliterated existing records. His technique was flawless. His energy management was so sophisticated that he finished the punishing sequence appearing less fatigued than candidates who had recorded times 30% slower. He was not just succeeding, he was redefining what success looked like in the context of special operations training. But it was the final component, the leadership challenge, that provided the most complete demonstration of his transformation. Faced with a crisis scenario requiring him to coordinate the actions of other candidates, Marcus displayed a level of tactical acumen and command presence that stunned everyone involved. His orders were precise, his situational awareness complete, his ability to adapt to changing circumstances seamless. The other candidates, who had been treating him as comic relief for 7 weeks, found themselves instinctively following his lead. There was something in his voice and bearing that commanded respect and inspired confidence. The person giving them orders was not just competent, he was displaying a level of leadership capability that exceeded anything they had seen from their peers throughout the program. The entire evaluation, from infiltration to leadership demonstration, had taken Marcus less than half the time allotted for the exercise. His performance had not just met the standards expected of elite special operations candidates, it had redefined those standards. Every metric by which the evaluation was measured had been not just achieved but obliterated. The silence that followed the completion of his demonstration was profound and prolonged. The instructors stared at their clipboards as if the numbers might change if they looked long enough. The other candidates stood in stunned confusion, trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with 7 weeks of established assumptions about Marcus's capabilities. The very foundations of their understanding of human potential and their own place in the hierarchy of excellence had been shaken. The transformation that had occurred was not just in Marcus's capabilities, but in everyone's perception of what was possible. The person they had dismissed as incompetent had just demonstrated a level of excellence that none of them could match. The recruit they had laughed at for weeks had just proven himself to be not just their equal, but their superior in every measurable way. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the demonstration was Marcus's demeanor throughout. He had performed these incredible feats not with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove himself, but with the calm confidence of someone revealing capabilities he had always known he possessed. There was no surprise in his expression, no celebration of unexpected success. He had simply demonstrated what he had become through 7 weeks of transformation that others had failed to notice. The psychological impact on the other candidates was profound and immediate. Everything they thought they knew about themselves, about excellence, about the nature of capability and potential, had been challenged by what they had just witnessed. The comfortable certainties of established hierarchies had been demolished in 40 seconds of transcendent performance. For the instructors, the implications were even more significant. Their ability to assess potential, to identify future elite operators, to understand the relationship between initial capability and ultimate performance had been called into question. They had not just failed to recognize Marcus's potential, they had actively dismissed him as unsuitable for the program he had just proven himself to dominate. The laughter had not just stopped, it had been replaced by a profound silence that spoke to the magnitude of what had been revealed. The man who had been mocked for his weakness had demonstrated strength that exceeded everyone else's. The recruit who had been written off as a mistake had proven to be the most capable candidate in the program's history. But Marcus himself seemed almost unaffected by the stunned reactions of others. The approval and recognition that might have meant everything to him 7 weeks earlier had become irrelevant. He had learned to derive his sense of worth from internal sources, to measure his progress against his own standards, to remain unmoved by others' assessments of his value. In destroying his weak self, the part of him that needed others' validation and feared their judgment, he had indeed become someone who could not be destroyed by others. The mockery that had once cut deep had become meaningless. The dismissal that had once caused pain had become irrelevant. He had transcended the need for others' approval by proving to himself that their opinions were based on incomplete information and limited understanding. The demonstration had proven more than just Marcus's individual capabilities. It had illustrated a profound truth about human potential and the relationship between perception and reality. It had shown that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is not the one everyone fears, but the one everyone ignores. It had demonstrated that genuine strength often emerges not from natural talent or favorable circumstances, but from the crucible of adversity and the determination to transform weakness into power. The 40 seconds that changed everything had revealed that everyone's assumptions about Marcus Webb had been fundamentally wrong. But, more importantly, they had proven that Marcus's assumptions about himself had been fundamentally right. He had known, through weeks of struggle and mockery, that he was becoming something greater than his current circumstances suggested. The evaluation had simply provided the stage for revealing what had been building in private for 7 weeks. The man who had arrived at Fort Braxton as a physical and tactical liability had departed as a legend. The transformation was complete, documented, and undeniable. The laughter had been replaced by respectful silence, the dismissal by recognition, the mockery by admiration. But, perhaps most significantly, Marcus had proven that the true measure of strength is not the absence of weakness, but the ability to transform weakness into power. He had shown that the most formidable opponents are often those who have learned to destroy their weak selves in the fire of adversity, emerging from that crucible immune to the destruction that others might attempt to inflict. The 40 seconds had indeed changed everything, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who witnessed them. They had provided a demonstration of human potential that challenged fundamental assumptions about capability, transformation, and the nature of true strength. They had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from natural advantages, but from the determination to overcome natural disadvantages through sustained effort and absolute commitment to excellence. The recruit who had been laughed at was laughing no longer, not because the jokes had stopped, but because he had transcended the need for others' approval entirely. He had become someone who could not be destroyed by others because he had already destroyed everything in himself that was vulnerable to their attacks. In that transformation lay a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of Fort Braxton, a testament to the indestructible strength that emerges when someone learns to master themselves completely. The end final word count, approximately 8,000 words. This document serves as a testament to the transformative power of adversity and the hidden strength that emerges when someone refuses to accept others' limitations as their own reality. The story of Marcus Webb reminds us that genuine strength is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to transform struggle into mastery.